Everyone, I hope everybody had a good rest last night, and we're ready for our second day. And today we have a big surprise. I want to introduce you our partner in crime, Professor King. Professor King has been a great inspiration, not only for Karen and me, but for a lot of people in Kennedy School. He's a lecturer in democracy and public policy here at Harvard. Professor chairs Harvard bipartisan program for the newly elected members of the U.S. Congress, and he directs a program for senior executives in state and local government. Well, Dr. King been helping us since this idea started to flourish, and he's a great believer in not only democracies but in North America, and we're really lucky to have him here this morning. And Dr. King, this is your own. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Is that like a still camera, or are we actually doing things like video?
Video.
Oh my
But
gosh.
we can.
You know what that means? It's like I have to constantly be aware of my posture now. I have to be like, oh my goodness, I have to be very careful about it. So I'll try. Good posture. I turn that. I just close this. It is a long time in coming, and I'm so glad to see you all here. Thank you also to the remarkable sponsors. I know Senex has been helping, and others folks have been pitching in as our team up here has been thinking about this over the last few years. And while some folks might imagine I'm doing this because I do care about representative government and healthy societies and healthy nonprofits and a proper balance between the private sector and their responsibilities to a larger community. That's true. That's all true. Of course I care about that. But more than anything, I care about the people in here who I know, my friends. We don't really start off at the Kennedy School having students. From the first day you're here, you're a colleague, and I've learned so much from you all. And I'm going to end on a note that's similar to how I'm beginning, the importance of the personal connection that outweighs so much that could be political or institutional. And I also was reflecting on what so many students get out of the Kennedy School. It's not just here are the institutions work. There's a wonderful professor we've had for a very long time now. His name is Marshall Gans. And Marshall is a fabulous organizer. He was Cesar Chavez's chief organizer. He left Harvard before graduating, between his junior and senior year, to go work in the civil rights domain for the summer. And he didn't come back until, I guess, about 1991. And he graduated from Harvard after being gone for so long. They still had his file. He just came on back and finished his senior year. And then applied to the Kennedy School, a year after getting his undergrad. But he had a heck of an interesting background. I handled his admissions file. I've been on the admissions committee for 26 years. And we sort of let him in rather quickly. And then immediately upon graduation, we hired him. So he went in just 2.5 years from having no undergraduate degree to being a member of the Harvard faculty, because he's remarkable and he has an amazing story. One of the things that Marshall has taught all of us is that one needs to understand, when relating to others, the story of the self. And I've never given this structure that I'm going to do now in any kind of public talk, but I want to do it in honor of our connection as Kennedy School students, because Marshall talks about the importance of the story of the self, the story of us, and then the story of now. And his theory is that we'll say some things in the story of us that allows us to, maybe you to connect with me, so I seem slightly more valid. And then the story of us is how a few of the highlights about what it actually does, we'll call it out, connect us. And then the story of now, Marshall says, is a call to arms. So I'm going to try the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. So I apologize if this is a little too personal to begin with, but I want to end on the personal as well. So I don't look like it. I don't look like the person I am in my soul, because I am a Bolivian citizen. I was born in La Paz at the Methodist Hospital in 1963. My parents were both missionaries in Bolivia. They weren't your typical missionaries, they were missionaries to the diplomatic community. My father was in charge of the Protestant church that handled all of sort of the diplomatic community in Bolivia, and my mother was working as a missionary in public health, so she was gone a lot of the time. I lived there for the first 6.5 years of my life. My first language was Aymara. It wasn't even Spanish. My baby book is completely in Spanish. And as a child, I saw the American flag, which was over the embassy, which was near to us. And I had this strange sense like I belonged there, and yet I didn't. And I began to have this sort of fantasy idea about what it would be like to be in the United States. What is that place like? While loving, just desperately loving Bolivia. Not my parents, forget that. They were off doing other things, but the connections that I had with two folks who took care of me and lived with us during all those years, Aleja and Eugenio. So, when I came to the United States as a young child, before we moved off to Wisconsin, where I grew up the rest of my life, we spent a year in D.C. And there, I was in the belly of the beast, right? You get to see all this political environment, and I was fascinated by it. As I grew up, my parents were involved in elective politics. I first went door to door on a campaign when I was 9 years old, the campaign in 1972, Senator Bell. But because I have these two personalities, these two parts of me, including separate passports, and by the way, you never use a Bolivian passport, period, right? That's the basic rule of life. But I think you're a cocaine smuggler. But because I had these two halves of me, when I entered into the world, I think I felt kind of like an anthropologist. I knew that I was of Wisconsin, but not completely of Wisconsin. And I knew that I was of Bolivia, but not completely of Bolivia. And I maintained, as I was growing up, this real naivete about making the world a better place, and the power of government, the power of religion. I believed in connection and in community when I was really small. I didn't become a minister, follow my parents' footsteps, because I don't happen to believe in the unique divinity of Christ. That's a bridge too far for me. What I believed in was the sense of power that I felt in my local communities and in the church and in the school. Always feeling a little bit like an outsider, and always believing a little too naively maybe in what the American flag stood for. Because even today, an important part of me is that 5-6-year-old child anticipating going to the United States for the first time and imagining what it would actually be like. So that's kind of the story of me, the story of self. It feels awkward to talk about. Fast forward, I ended up getting a job here. I've been here for 27 years. Okay, fine. And now the story of us. By us, I mean our three great nations. I mean the Western Hemisphere, especially sort of North America generally. And when we think about the story of us, there are narratives of greatness that each of our countries have. And those narratives of greatness we kind of soak in as children, much like I soaked in these naive messages about what my countries, Bolivia and the United States, were supposed to be like. Each of our cultures, each of our countries has foundation myths, meaning it isn't necessarily true, but we like to believe that it's true. So Canada has a foundation myth. and it just doesn't happen to begin only recently. It's quite old. And every country also has two sides of these foundation myths. There are the things that we really want and need to believe about ourselves. Otherwise, we as citizens might have trouble sleeping at night. And then there's a fairly offensive side to our own foundation myths, one of hegemony, the sense of so let me talk about the three categories in the development of the nations of us, and especially to begin with the United States. I believe that we are maybe in our adolescence as a nation. You know, we like to tell ourselves and tell our children and tell the world that we're the world's greatest democracy and we should follow our democratic rules and procedures. We are so young on the world stage. Our history is largely one, it would appear, if you look at the dominant narratives, of a monoculture. Our country was founded with a very heterogeneous mix of people, lots of different cultures and so forth. But it was predominantly governed, and still is, by a white male Protestant culture. And we have these things that we aspire to in our founding documents, but they are wishes more than things that we actually managed to do. Our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, these are noble ideas, but we could not implement them in practice. All countries have those kinds of elements of noble ideas, and one test for the greatness of a nation is what the goals we set for ourselves and how we actually move there. So we have this long history of monoculturalism that has worked out pretty well for the people who look like me. And over the last 30 years, there's been an important rise in multiculturalism. Multiculturalism in which people identify, and we see this in the public opinion polls, primarily as a blank American, which is your primary sense of your being, an African American, an Asian American, and so on and so forth, as opposed to an American American who happens to be Asian, or happens to be black, or happens to be Hispanic. There's been an important rise in multiculturalism, but I think it's a dangerous concept, and I kind of reject the way that we have politically talked about multiculturalism in this country, because it puts one's identity, one's group identity, one's sense of self often above the nation and the idea of what it means to be an American. And we see this constantly now, the reactions against it, this tribalism, this embracing of multiculturalism. I think this divide between multiculturalism and omniculturalism is a false one. We don't necessarily have to have that division, because while we have a monocultural history, we are really a multicultural blend, and it's something that a social commentator named Eric Root calls omniculturalism. And omniculturalism is a hybrid of cultures. It's one environment where people can embrace their multiple identities, but it's subsumed under a sense of what it means to be a citizen of the nation or a citizen of that particular broader community. Monoculturalism restricted people's rights. Multiculturalism, as we have talked about it, divides people into their own camps. The United States now, just in the last year, has become a majority non-white nation among births, right? New children. And within, depends on what you look at, but certainly within the next 15 years, we will become a non-white majoritarian country. And that's a beautiful and wonderful thing, unless we continue to divide along multicultural lines. But the success in the past of our country has been what Eric would identify as omnicultural. At the time of our founding, we had remarkable groups of interesting tapestry. Right? You had English in New England, who bitterly opposed, hated the kinds of English who were actually down in the Virginias. They came from opposite sides of the English Civil War in the 1600s. You had the Germans who had made it through the open ports of Pennsylvania, who wanted to build an entire new culture, an entire new Christian culture here. By the way, when we had our first census, national census in the year 1790, 38% of the population responding to that census in Pennsylvania, the entire state, only spoke German. Only spoke no English. 38% only spoke German, and a much higher percentage spoke German and some other language, presumably English. That looks like multiculturalism, and yet it isn't. They were tied together by a common destiny, a common sense of purpose. The Dutch communities that grew up along the Hudson River before the English changed New Amsterdam to New York had their own cultural imprint here. The African slaves had an incredibly important imprint here, and we would not have made it as a country without their blood, sweat, and death early on. We have to embrace and acknowledge all of that. How is it with all of that apparent division early on, we had this idea of omniculturalism? It's through the blending of cultures, the sense to a higher service that was so important. I was in Los Angeles recently and was amazed to see that I could pick up a kimchi burrito. A kimchi burrito. That's the most beautiful thing you've ever heard, isn't it? A kimchi burrito. That's the blending of cultures that is possible here. And that's, I think, the story of us. Us. Right? Canada. Right? I can't speak about Canada with any great depth and understanding, so I have my impressions, right? Catherine, I have my impressions of Canada. I think of it sometimes as kind of like the Goldilocks of choices on political institutions. It is sort of a federal system, everyone has a little power locally, and yet there's the interesting legacy of loyalty to the British Crown in the sense that can bind them together in interesting ways. Canada, like the United States, is, again, relatively new, but chose very interesting different paths around the time of the American Revolution. And many of the sins that we visited on the native cultures and on each other in the United States, Canada also visited on their people, including the horrific expulsion of a large French population long before Canada became Canada, the subjugation of many native peoples, as we have done also. And yet Canada made an interesting and important shift away from that kind of intolerance and hubris. Canada's now a remarkably, at least on the surface, tolerant nation. Though there's a remarkable deference to authority as well in Canada, much more so than in the United States. The sense that we should, in many cases, according to the public opinion polls, actually follow leaders. The latest surveys in Canada worry us, generally, that there is a stronger and stronger anti-immigrant sense in the country. And you hear people whispering about it regularly. I was in Montreal last month for a full week, and beautiful, beautiful place, Montreal. But when folks could see that I was open to listening to them and sitting at the bakery, I heard more than an earful of the kind of talk we're used to in the United States. If I'm open to conversations with some good old white boys, you wouldn't believe the things that they say. And the same is creeping into much of the culture right now, anti-immigrant culture and intolerance because of immigration. Mexico. Mexico, oh my God. It's unbelievable your history is so much more amazing than the history of the United States and the history of Canada. What you've gone through, the remarkable periods of growth, the remarkable entrepreneurialism. Yet, like us, it's a story often of conquest and conversion early on. I like to think of it as sort of two sides of the Roman Catholic heritage. The two sides of the Roman Catholic heritage are conversion, come join us, we're going to save your souls, and also conquest. So it's conversion by force. But either, whether you're looking at the Catholic heritage, which is embedded in so many of the cultural institutions in Mexico, as conquest or conversion, there's one thing we see very obvious in predominantly Catholic communities and cultures, and they're embedded in institutional structures. And that is a remarkable deference towards hierarchy. A remarkable deference towards hierarchy. It's a huge difference between the United States, which begins primarily as a Protestant nation that completely rejected notions of Roman Catholicism. And the idea in Protestantism was that the church itself should be the governing body, the local church. They would elect their own priests. Their own ministers would be elected in a Protestant congregation. We think of the Puritans as the Puritans. They never called themselves the Puritans. They called themselves Congregationalists because it was at the Congress level, the congregation level, that they elevated people. We had the highest literacy rate in the world at the time of our founding. Mexico, it was not an emphasis in Mexican education in the 1600s and 1700s. It was a different relationship. But the main relationship towards reading and education in the United States was not because it was the betterment of the society, but it was because it was the obligation of parents to teach their children how to individually read the Word of God and interpret it individually. So there's this really interesting distinction between how the institutions were set up in Mexico and also primarily the Catholic countries of Central and South America and in North America. And you see it play out in so many ways, a stronger sense of, within a capitalist sense, kind of competition at all times for souls in the church in the North. Protestant church against Protestant church on the Congo. Mexico, when I look at your history, what I find so fascinating is the initial period of colonization and discovery. And I hope that you all can own the dark side of it as well as the bright side of it. You don't move ahead as a nation without both dark and light sides of our own foundation myths and our own histories. What was the size of the native population in Mexico at the time of European contact? Well, the best estimates now say 27 million people in Mexico at the time of European contact. And in the central area of Mexico, that was true. We didn't record that level of population again until the 1960s. We have to be honest with ourselves about what holds us together as communities, the dark side and the light side. All right. So one other point I really wanted to make, and I skipped over on the story of us, and that is what it means to be a nation of immigrants. We think about this multicultural sense, and right now there's this anti-immigrant bias in the United States. But to the extent that our three cultures, our history, certainly right now Canada, to some extent the United States, and increasingly Mexico, is a nation of immigrants. Let's pay attention to what that means in our own histories. The power of our growth has been through immigrants. Because immigrants are a particular type of individual. Of course, most of our history, we had massive waves of voluntary immigrants that came here of desperation or desire to make a new start and a new dollar. What's different about immigrants as opposed to those who stayed behind in China or Europe or Central and South America? They tend to be later born children, not first born children, later born children. And they tend to be folks who are very risk accepting. They're not risk neutral. Immigrants also have an overwhelming tendency to be anti-hierarchical. So they're much less likely to trust institutions and hierarchies, regardless of where they come from. They're much more risk accepting, and they're later born sort of anti-authoritarian types. Those are the qualities that have built our nations. And right now, because of this spasm of tribalism between the multiculturalists and the monoculturalists, we have failed to really recognize what the real impact of that could be. That's the story, I think, of us. Okay, the story of now. I apologize for keeping going on so long. I want to tell you another thing we talk about at the school. We generally like to think about, and it's too easy of a distinction, but go with it anyway, the distinctions between three major sectors in modern societies. Between the private sector, very important, right? That's what keeps us going. That's our economic engine. The private sectors, we need to have regulatory structures, tax structures, all kinds of structures to try and foster that, right? While treading off to make sure the society is not hurt overall. The public sector, right? Governments, however they're formed, and our governments have a lot more in common than they do that separates them in terms of their history, their culture, their democratic norms and procedures. There's much more that we have in common. And then the nonprofit sector, the NGO sector. So we kind of understand what the private sector looks like and the public sector looks like. And sometimes the lines between them are going to be a little odd. The nonprofit sector is this weird thing that the definition of it varies from country to country. Because the nonprofit sector is dependent upon the government sector to even exist, whether it's through tax status or other kinds of preferential treatments. And the idea is, of course, as you know, the nonprofit sectors are mission-oriented. Of course, private companies are mission-oriented as well, but their mission is mostly for a broader purpose, and the excess rents that are generated through their activities are funneled back into the organizations as opposed to back into shareholders. So every country has a slightly different structure of what a nonprofit actually look like. And in the United States, because we have historically not trusted the government, we have the largest nonprofit sector as a percentage of the GDP in the world among all westernized systems. There's some countries that depend on nonprofits from outside, and among all developed countries, by far the largest nonprofit sector. And part of that is because we have subcontracted much of the work of government, often in the private sector, like Harvard University, a nonprofit, which is crazy. Crazy. But it's a nonprofit, right? For the funders, I just want to let you know, it is actually a hedge fund with classrooms attached, okay? So we call it a nonprofit. So these are the three sectors. And we hope that you, in this wonderful enterprise work that undertaking, well, imagine your lives in each one of these sectors. Definitely spend time in the private sector. Definitely spend time in the government sector. Absolutely be involved in the nonprofit sector because they have different purposes and different energies, and you can do so much good work in each of these. But we also talk about the three great levels. And of course, there are more than three levels, but here are the three great levels. The multinational level is connections among our countries. These large trade agreements, the United Nations, the WTO, and on and on and on. And then the national level, national government, nationally based private enterprises, nationally based nonprofits, and then the local level, very, very local. So if you imagine this 3 columns and 3 rows, the story of most of governing in the 20th century was right in the middle of that. It was the focus and energy of a lot of what was happening with the larger public in the United States and in Mexico and in Canada was at the intersection of those, at the national level and in the government sector. That's where economic development was really being, policies on economic development were being done. That's where social development policies were being done. And the story of the last, probably now about 30 years, and clearly the story of the rest of my lifetime, is the dispersion up, down, and out from the national government. So we've seen in the last 30 years an important rise in the power and importance of multinational organizations across all three sectors. Multinational conglomerations in the private sector, multinational organizations in the government sector, multinational organizations in the NGO world. And we've also seen in all of our countries the remarkable growth of local governments, local industries, and local nonprofits. You certainly saw that change in power in the last 10 years in Mexico. With a more rapid and vigorous democratization at the mayoral level. A different kind of political party competition that is much more vibrant now at the local level than when we were all much, much younger. So that's an important part of the now that we're dealing with, is this trend, right? Not to focus as much on national government as where things get done. Also, over the last 30 years, we've seen across all of our, certainly across our three countries, but it's larger than this, an incredible decline in personal trust, interpersonal trust, and institutional trust. So trust is dramatically on the decline. And what happens when we don't trust each other? We look for other tribes that will help to connect us. Now there is some trust that I want to share some evidence with you. This comes from Pew Global Attitude Surveys in 2014. It's of 44 nations. And unfortunately they didn't ask about Canada. And the reason they don't ask about Canada in the Pew Global Attitude Surveys is they use the United States as a proxy for Canada. How about that for a cultural agenda? Right? So we don't ask about Canada. Who needs to ask about Canada? We just look at the studies in the United States. But we do have 44 nations that include the United States and Mexico, because obviously we're so different, although we're not. And so the questions were about what leads to success in life. You know, a series of questions about what leads to success in life. And then it's a 5-category answer. It's called the Likert scale. And if we look at the things that say, okay, this is really important to success in life, it's sort of the 4th and the 5th categories. So the numbers don't add up to 100% for every country. But this is an indication of what the respondents in those countries think was really important for success in life. And there are a whole lot of variables. I'm just going to describe a few of them. What's important for success in life? Is it luck? Is that how you get to be successful in life? Is it hard work? You get to be successful in life because of really hard work. Is it having a good education? Or is it because you have remarkably good self-control? You're in charge of your own success in life. So those are some of the dimensions. And well, let's take one of them, luck. How do you get ahead in life? What you need to be successful in life? Luck. No huge surprise, I guess. 67% of the respondents in Uganda said, you want to be successful in life, you sure as heck have to be lucky. Can you imagine living your life with the idea that that's how you're going to get ahead in life? It's just luck. Where's the individual agency in that? They're followed by Tunisia and the Philippines in terms of luck. Well, Mexico and the United States are considerably further down the line on the importance of luck. Out of 44 nations, Mexico comes in 29th, where 27% of the respondents say you get really important and lucky. And in the United States, they're 35th out of 44. They say that 19% say you really have to be lucky. That's what leads to success in life. But let's think about hard work. Right? Hard work. In order to be successful in life, you have to work hard. In Colombia, the #1 nation, 78%. Argentina, 78%. The United States, 73%. Mexico comes in at 9th at 61%. And you get an interesting cluster of the nations of North America and Central America and South America on the importance of hard work. This is one important dimension that separates us from the rest of the world. You want to be successful in life? You have to work hard. What country do you think might be the last in the importance of hard work? China. China comes in 44th out of 44 nations at 12%, saying, yeah, it's kind of important to work hard in order to be successful in life. So, what about, a good education? How about, well, one thing I like to measure is self-control, the importance of work hard and having self-control in terms of getting ahead in life. Among the 44 nations that you add self-control and work hard, the United States is #1, followed by Venezuela, followed by Mexico, Colombia. You see again, it's a part of who we are culturally that really adds up to make us not just countries that believe in some self-reliance and the importance of hard work. It's part of our cultural DNA. It's because we are still nations of immigrants. So that's kind of exciting. But with trust on the decline, trust among individuals and trust within institutions on the decline, and with the locations of government and the locations of power now going away from the national levels, up and out, and down and out, with a sense of confidence in our national identities, with 3 countries right now rocked by divisiveness politically and in terms of multicultural divisiveness. Where are we right now? Some of the work I've been doing since 2002 is proprietary work for the U.S. Marine Corps. It's for J. Walter Thompson's advertising arm, U.S. Marine Corps. And I wrote a book about confidence and trust in the military, and that came out in the early 2000s. And I've been on retainer with contracts with the U.S. Recruiting Command for the military since about 2001. And a few weeks ago, we spent 3 amazing days looking at the latest evidence, what's impacting recruiting for the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps is going to be fine, a good ad agency. But the data is just so stark and so troubling in important ways. The very youngest generation, I happen to be like an older generation, I'm a baby boomer, I'm much older than most of you in the room. And then you have sort of Generation X and then the millennials and now this new generation, which people are either calling the Homeland generation or the iGen for the iPhone. This generation is astonishingly, it's hard to even think, because I have children and grandchildren who are sort of in that age now, right? I have a grandson. Suicide rates in the last 15 years among young people have gone up 60%. Social connectedness, all measures of social connectedness are on an incredibly steep decline. And most of it dating around 2012, 2013. The data beginning 2012, 2013 is just astonishing. It's plummeting. Depression's on the increase. Again, this is true across our 3 nations, young people in depression. If you'd like a quick view of some of this, there's a new book called iGen. It's by Gene Twenge, a professor from out in California. It's a remarkably good book. And it's a frightening book. When I started doing this generational work on military, we saw the last generation is one that was really called to purpose and national service. And so the military's advertising started to play to that sense, right? You run towards the sound of chaos and you defend your home and your country and all. It wasn't about personal transformation, which was the be-all-you-can-be kind of story. So the reality is that if you're in the business of marketing, whatever your product happens to be, and if it's the U.S. Marine Corps, it's marketing patriotism, it's marketing the nation. How do you market to the next generation that's so disconnected, that's depressed, that's anxious, that is incredibly lonely, although they're connected on the internet and on their phones? They're very, very lonely. That's the reality of where we are right now in all three of our countries. Those kids who are 15 years old are addicted to their phones. It's like it's glued to their hands. And that crowds out all of these other moments where we can actually connect with each other. That's the story of now. Right? The story of now is, one, government at the national level isn't the future right now. The powers and functions of governing a society are in the nonprofit sector, the for-profit sector, at the multinational level, at the local levels, and of course there's still an important role at the national level, but the juice is moving in those other directions. Second, huge decline in institutional and interpersonal trust. And then this crisis of connectedness, loneliness, anxiety. So North America now is, if you look at it, it's kind of a maybe a frightening place. But what is the story of us in this room, the story of now for us? I think it comes down to the kinds of connections that I feel to my students, to my community. It's connections at the individual level, not on the internet, not through LinkedIn, not these stupid social preening Facebook posts and Instagram meals. Right now, the importance of what you're doing here in this room, last night, tomorrow, it can't be overstated. It can't be overstated. You have to travel with each other and see the world in these three sectors: the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and of course the government sector. The future of North America is one of connectedness. The future of North America will be a future of multiculturalism shaped into omniculturalism, a blending of cultures and perspectives with a strong refreshing of the immigrant spirit, inviting people and trade from around the world. That's our history and that's our unique future. So the story of now has to be what you're doing. It has to be doubling down on personal connections. If you're going to be a part of this, it's not another stupid line on your resume. It can't be another moment that you can sort of check off and say, yeah, I'm a part of that as well. Look at this, I've got quite a growing list. It has to be a commitment to investing in the people in this room and the people who are bringing your orbit. Yes, you have to have an institutional structure. Yes, there will need to be budget. Yes, it's going to be costly. Yes, you're going to have to take time away from your family and friends and travel. But the future of this organization ought to be modeling for you and for others the future of the cooperation among these three great countries. Personal connections, caring about each other, seeing each other face to face, forget the superficial, solve problems together in a truly omnicultural way. And so that's why I'm excited to be part of this. I'm just going to be watching it most of the time, but the coffee's good. There's always food to eat, and I like food. And I'm happy to welcome you all to Harvard. And thank you so much for what you're doing and the investment that you're taking, obviously for yourself, but more importantly, the investment that you're making in each other.